The rise and fall of David. In 1 Samuel 9 through 15, we read about the rise and fall of Saul. The next section of the book moves on to the rise and fall of David. A common misconception of these two kings is that essentially Saul was bad and David was good. Saul was prideful and disobedient and sought his own glory, while David was humble and repentant when he sinned and sought God's glory. There's actually a lot of truth to those statements, but to view one king as wholly good or wholly bad is far too simplistic. Now, my hunch is that this view is related to a very common misunderstanding of the following idea that David was a man after God's own heart. The problem is that this phrase doesn't mean what you might think it means. This statement occurs in 1 Samuel 13 when Saul had disobeyed the Lord's instructions given through Samuel and offered a sacrifice when he wasn't supposed to. So Samuel declared to him, "The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him to be ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Now, when it says that the Lord was going to establish a man after his own heart, David isn't explicitly named there, but we know the man refers to David, since David is the next king whom God has Samuel appoint in place of Saul. People often assume that the phrase means something like David has a godly heart, or David's heart wants what God's heart wants. But the Hebrew phrase there, which is kalevavo, it literally means a man according to his heart or to his will. Because in Hebrew thinking, the heart was the seat of the will. It was the place where decision-making was done. So the phrase according to his, and that refers to God, right? According to God's heart, more likely means according to God's choice. In other words, what Samuel is saying to Saul is that God is choosing a different man to reign. It's not referring to the heart of the person being chosen. Now, the CEB version of the Bible probably translates this the best of any modern translation. It reads as, "The Lord will search for a man of his own choosing." And we know this is the case because later in 2 Samuel 7:21, David's praying to the Lord, thanking him for bringing him up from a lowly family to reign as king and to receive amazing promises of future blessing. And David says, "For the sake of your word and according to your own heart or will, you have done this great thing so that your servant would know it." So David is referencing the fact that he is king because it was God's heart, aka choice, for him to be king. Now, this is not to say that David does not, often have a heart that genuinely seeks God. David does have deep-rooted faith in Yahweh, and I think that we actually see a clear distinction between him and Saul, specifically in how they respond to their own sin. Saul seems to blame other people for his wrongdoing, while David often owns up to his sins and repents. So I don't want to minimize that at all. But at the same time, David does many things that don't reflect what is good and right before God. And if we view him by the lens of someone who has a heart of God, that could lead us dangerously, I think, to excuse or even overlook all of his negative qualities. But David, like Saul, is a human who has character flaws. I like this quote that one scholar writes, which is that once we consent to embrace biblical heroes in all their humanity, the story becomes more interesting. So let's look at the rise and fall of David in snapshots. And even throughout this summary of David's rise, please don't hate me, but I'm going to intentionally draw your attention to some of his character flaws. So in 1 Samuel 16, we're introduced to David as the youngest of 8 sons of Jesse, who keeps the sheep, and he is not like an obvious choice for the next king of Israel. In fact, when Samuel goes to anoint one of Jesse's sons, Jesse brings before him all 7 of his oldest sons, and God says no to all of them. So Samuel has to straight up ask him, is there anybody else? So to start off with, David fits that theological vision laid out in Hannah's song of God raising up the lowly and bringing down the proud and oppressive. God is raising up this lowly shepherd boy. Now, 1 Samuel 17 describes David's renowned accomplishment of defeating Goliath, that very tall Philistine war general. David is willing to stand up to Goliath when nobody else will. His confidence is Yahweh's ability to save, and his desire is to make Yahweh's name known. But at the same time, David is not in it for nothing. He asks, what will the person get who defeats this man? And he finds out that he'll be rewarded with riches and with the king's daughter. Now, in 1 Samuel 16 through 18, we also find out that pretty much everybody loves David. Even Saul at first cares immensely for David. Saul's son Jonathan develops a close friendship with him, and Saul's daughter, Michal, loves David, and the two of them get married. But then in 1 Samuel 21 through 22, it describes a somewhat questionable situation. So David's on the run from Saul, who at this point wants to kill him. So he goes to the priest Ahimelech and he asks for bread. He has to lie to him to get the food, actually. He has to make him think that he's there on behalf of Saul. But that deception is probably understandable because he is starving. But when Saul finds out, he murders Ahimelech and his entire family, except for one man named Abiathar. And when Abiathar escapes to tell David about it, David confesses that he is the one to blame for the deaths of his father's family. If we jump to 1 Samuel 23, we see that this tells about a battle that David fights, and in it we see David's commitment to Yahweh in seeking out an answer from Yahweh as to whether or not he should fight before he actually enters the battle. And Yahweh speaks to David and guides him and gives him success in battle. In 1 Samuel 24 and 26, we see David showing his righteousness and faith in God by the fact that David refuses to harm Saul, even though Saul's trying to kill him. So David shows respect for God's anointed one, even when it might cost him his own life. But David does give in to his desire at one point, and when David's hiding in a cave, Saul comes in to relieve himself, and David can't help himself from reaching out and cutting off the corner of Saul's robe. But he also immediately feels horrible about it. And so this is an example of how David's response to sin is generally an admirable one, where he confesses and owns up to it. There's a not so flattering story sandwiched in between chapters 24 and 26. And this is a story in which David gets angry that this guy named Nabal wasn't going to share his food with David and his men. So he makes a plan to kill Nabal on account of this. But Abigail, Nabal's wife, intervenes. She stops David from killing her husband. And after she stops him, David confesses. He says, "You saved me from taking vengeance into my own hands." When Nabal does eventually die, David takes Abigail as a wife. So notice that David is now starting to accumulate wives, which is a no-no for the kings of Israel. So all this to say, in the story of David's rise, we see David's commitment to Yahweh, his confidence in Yahweh, his trust and patience that Yahweh will work good. And we also see his questionable behavior. He takes multiple wives, which is prohibited for a king. He's sometimes dishonest. He nearly kills someone and gets innocent blood on his hands. He's tempted to harm Saul, even in the midst of his patience with God's plan. And this is important because many of us know of David's major fall that occurs with Bathsheba and Uriah. But as one scholar writes, ascents do not suddenly become descents. When people commit major moral failings, they usually do not come out of nowhere. They usually show signs of problematic or unethical behavior prior to a major unethical decision. That's why the book of Proverbs is emphatic that there is no such thing as a small sin. Every action is a step along a particular path, and it is leading you somewhere, whether that somewhere is life or death. You will read the events of 2 Samuel 11 through 12 for yourself. This is the infamous story with Bathsheba that's David's big fall. But here's just a very quick summary. David sees a woman bathing, Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, and he sends for his men who bring her to him. He has sex with her and sends her home. She gets pregnant and sends word to him of that fact. Now, her husband Uriah is off at war, so David brings her husband home, tries to get him drunk, and get him to go home and have sex with his wife. But her husband Uriah refuses to go home and sleep with his wife because he insists on showing solidarity with his fellow soldiers who are camped out in, terrible weather, suffering as they're at war. So David arranges to have Uriah killed in battle, making it look like an accident. And this will cover up perhaps the fact that he himself has gotten Uriah's wife pregnant. Now, sometimes this story is incorrectly interpreted as though this event is Bathsheba's fault or partially her fault. She's depicted as a temptress or adulteress, but the narrative itself is actually moving the reader in the exact opposite direction. First of all, it's highlighting the Torah following or the law following of both Bathsheba and Uriah in contrast to David, who breaks the Torah. So one of the main reasons that Bathsheba is even bathing at all, or that's mentioned by the narrator, is because the narrator is trying to show that she's following Torah. She's purifying herself according to the Levitical law. One scholar writes, Bathsheba is entirely passive and attempts to make her an equal partner or even temptress miss the point. She's seen, described, named, summoned, and lain with. What she thought of the affair is left unsaid. What matters is that this is a massive abuse of power. Okay, and then when it comes to Uriah, similarly, he is being shown keeping the law. Why won't he just sleep with his wife? Well, because of the Torah. He's following a law which requires sexual abstinence for active soldiers from Deuteronomy. So David has become the king who takes, the type of king that Samuel warned the people about in Samuel 8, while his subjects, the people that he is supposed to reign over, they are the ones actually following the law. And David is, in this story, repeating the old story of Adam and Eve. In 2 Samuel 11:25, after Uriah is killed, David tells his general, do not consider this thing to be evil. So in Brad Kelly's words, in telling the Old Testament story, what David's doing in this pronouncement to his general is he's suggesting that he, like the first humans in the garden, David himself can determine what's right and wrong. So it's the prototypical sin. And it also follows the ongoing sin problem in the Old Testament of seeing and taking, which also started with Adam and Eve. Remember back in Genesis 3 that the woman saw that the tree was good for food and a delight to the eyes, and she took of its fruit and she ate. Similarly, David saw Bathsheba on the roof, and he sent messengers who took her into his house. So he's copying this prototypical sin. Now, when God sends Nathan to pronounce condemnation on David, Nathan says, "Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight?" Right? So Nathan is calling him out. You thought you could determine what is right and wrong, evil and good. And David has explicitly said to Joab, "Don't consider this thing evil." And Nathan's saying, "This is evil. What you've done is evil." So again, the point of the whole story is showing the gravity of this sin that David has committed. Now, notice, like he's done before, when David is confronted, he confesses that he has sinned, and God puts away his sin. The text says that the Lord has removed his sin, God forgives him. But there are grave consequences for his actions, including the fact that the baby who was conceived will die. And after this event, David's family descends into turmoil. So remember how the book of Samuel began and the vision that was laid out there. God exalts the lowly and brings down the prideful. And we've seen both of those things occur with David. He was the youngest of 8 sons, a shepherd boy from a humble family, and God raised him up to reign as king of Israel. But when David himself becomes the one to start to abuse the power God has given him, who himself takes from the lowly, God brings David down just as he did other leaders before him.